The landmark federal court judgment in May 2020 that found Vic Forests had breached a code of practice and banned logging in 67 coops in the Central Highlands in May 2020, a historic decision was made by the Federal Court of Australia that changed the fate of Victoria's forests and wildlife. The court ruled that Vic Forests, the state-owned logging company, had illegally destroyed the habitat of two threatened species: the greater glider and the leadbeater's possum. These animals are native to the Central Highlands region, where Vic Forests had been logging for decades under a special exemption from federal environmental laws. The case was brought by Friends of Leadbeater's Possum, an environmental group that challenged Vic Forests' compliance with the Regional Forestry Agreement, RFA. The RFA is a deal between the state and federal governments that allows logging to proceed without federal approval, as long as it follows a code of practice that protects biodiversity and conservation values. Friends of Leadbeater's Possum argued that Vic Forests had breached the code of practice by failing to conduct adequate surveys for threatened species, ignoring expert advice, and logging in areas that were critical for their survival. The court agreed with the environmental group and found that Vic Forests had not complied with the RFA. The court also found that Vic Forests logging had a significant impact on the greater glider and the leadbeater's possum, which are both protected under the Federal Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, EPBC Act. The court ordered an injunction on Vic Forests, stopping them from logging in 66 areas. One area was later added, where these species were known or likely to occur. The judgment was a landmark victory for Victoria's forests and wildlife, as it was the first time in 20 years that forestry operations were subject to federal environmental laws. It also set a precedent for other regions and states where logging is exempt from federal scrutiny. The judgment exposed the flaws and failures of the RFA system, which had allowed logging to continue despite its devastating impacts on native ecosystems and endangered species. The judgment was celebrated by environmentalists, scientists, and community groups who had been campaigning for years to protect Victoria's forests from logging. It also sparked calls for an end to native forest logging and a transition to a sustainable plantation-based industry. However, the judgment was not the end of the legal battle, as Vic Forests appealed the decision to a higher court. The outcome of that appeal would determine the future of Victoria's forests and wildlife. The historic victory for Victoria's forests was short-lived. In May 2021, Vic Forests, the state-owned logging company, won a controversial court appeal that overturned the ban on logging in 66 coops of native forest habitat. This meant logging could resume in these areas, despite the threats it posed to endangered wildlife such as the leadbeater's possum and the greater glider. The appeal was based on a technicality. Vic Forests argued that its logging operations were exempt from federal environmental laws because they were covered by a Regional Forest Agreement, RFA, between the state and federal governments. These agreements are supposed to balance conservation and commercial interests, but they also allow logging to avoid federal scrutiny. The federal court agreed that Vic Forests logging failed to meet its environmental legal requirements. In fact, the court dismissed every single ground of appeal but one. And it takes only one to win. The court ruled that the RFA exemption applied to Vic Forests logging, even if it breached state rules. This decision was a blow to the environmental groups that had sued Vic Forests in the first place. Friends of the Leadbeater's Possum had successfully argued in 2020 that Vic Forests had violated the precautionary principle, which requires logging to avoid serious or irreversible harm to threatened species. The court had ordered Vic Forests to stop logging in 66 coops and pay legal costs. But after the appeal, Vic Forests was free to resume logging in these areas, as well as in other parts of Victoria's forests that are not protected by national parks or conservation reserves. The company said it would follow a new code of practice that aims to reduce the impact of logging on wildlife and habitats. But environmental groups said this was not enough to ensure the survival of forest-dependent species. The appeal also had wider implications for Australia's forest management. It effectively weakened the federal government's role in protecting threatened species from logging. It also raised questions about the validity and effectiveness of regional forest agreements, which have been criticized for being outdated, unenforceable, and biased towards logging interests. The appeal by Vic Forests and the subsequent reversal of the ban in May 2021 was a setback for Victoria's forests and their wildlife. It showed that logging still has a powerful influence over forest policy and practice, despite growing public support for conservation and climate action. It also highlighted the need for stronger and more consistent environmental laws at both state and federal levels.